Hello, Brass Method students. I hope you're all healthy at home and managing the hiatus well. This morning, I am joined by Professor Charles Snead, better known as Skip. He is the director of the School of Music and professor of horn. Today, we are going to chat about the horn, including pedagogy, its history, and other fun facts. Skip, thank you for joining us this morning.
I'm very glad to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to do this.
Thank you. So, if you would, just give us a little bit about your background, where you studied, who you studied with, and just kind of give us your journey up to this point.
Wow, okay, very quickly. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. Started playing the horn actually in the third grade. I was fortunate that back in those days, in the 1960s actually, you could start elementary school band programs that young. So I grew up in a musical family. My mother had also been a horn player, so she introduced me to the horn and started studying the horn and played throughout public school years and did Atlanta Symphony Youth Orchestra and things like that. And was spent that time studying with the principal horn player in the Atlanta Symphony and did a lot of orchestral excerpts and things like that. And was fortunate to actually win a professional job right out of high school. So that took me to Jacksonville, Florida, where I began playing with the Jacksonville Symphony when I was 18. And as a result, also did my undergraduate degree in Jacksonville, Florida at Jacksonville University. And I played with the Jacksonville Symphony for 6 years, then went back to graduate school because I knew I had an interest in getting into college teaching. So I went back and did my graduate degrees at the University of Georgia in Athens. And then after that, I taught for 4 years at Murray State University from 1984 to 1988. And in 1988, was very fortunate to come to the University of Alabama as professor of horn. And I am in my 31st year here at the University of Alabama. And during that time, have played with a number of orchestras around the Southeast and around the region. And also have been for many years and still am off and on a member of the Transatlantic Horn Quartet with my colleagues Michael Thompson and Richard Watkins and David Ohanian. So I've been fortunate to do a lot of fun and engaging things in my career. And but the thing I think most is teaching, being able to engage young horn students and see their success and the things they accomplish is what really makes all of this a whole lot of fun. So it's been a good journey and I've really enjoyed it. And it's always nice to have an opportunity to speak with this class about aspects of horn and how they can get the next generation of horn players excited about what they do.
Thank you. And this is a great class, by the way. And they've got some great questions for you. And I have no doubt that they're all going to be great music educators in the future. And you've got two former students here at, at the greenhouse.
Yes, very proud of both of you all.
So who did you study horn from?
My principal teachers, as I said, I was fortunate in high school to study with Merwin Chrisman, who was with the Atlanta Symphony. In Jacksonville, I studied with Karen Thornton, who was Jacksonville University, then also became a major freelancer in DC and Baltimore. After that, the bulk of my professional career, one of my principal teachers and major influences was Dale Clevenger. Dale was the principal horn in the Chicago Symphony for about 45 years and one of the preeminent orchestral horn players of the past generation, and certainly one of the most important horn players in history, really. I was also fortunate to be able to do some lessons off and on with Philip Farkas, one of the great horn pedagogues of the 20th century. Barry Tuckwell, one of the principal soloists of the late 20th century. And one of my major influences, although I didn't do any formal lessons with him, but one of my colleagues who I've played with quite a bit, Michael Thompson, one of the great English soloists of this recent generation. Michael was a great influence on my playing as well.
I think when you talk about like horn history and the history of horn pedagogy, that those are all the big hot names that come up, and you've managed to interact with all of them on some level, and that's pretty amazing.
I was very fortunate to be able to have contact with a lot of those people, and I of course bring a lot of the influence from those people into my own teaching, and I I feel very fortunate to be a first generation sharer of that information with all of my current students.
So for the next portion, I'm just going to kind of give the floor to you and anything that you want to talk about with the horn, and I'll probably prod you with questions along the way. But otherwise, the floor is generally yours.
Okay, I'm just going to take off and go a little bit with kind of the same lecture that I might present where we actually standing in class, and just go over a few basics that I always like to introduce and reinforce for people who are going to be bringing students to the horn for the first time. So this is really geared maybe towards potentially what you might encounter in a middle school program, where you might be bringing a young horn student to the instrument for the first time, or even potentially a high school program where you might be reorienting a student to the horn in the proper way should they may have possibly have gotten off on the wrong, or maybe they've programmed and need a little bit of reinforcement. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this because I hope to a large degree this is part of the obvious. But of course, within instrument, the aspect of breathing is paramount. I like to remind anybody, I remind my own students frequently that even if you're doing everything with a brass instrument, particularly the horn, absolutely correctly from a physical standpoint, let's assume that the embouchure is perfect. Let's assume that everything about what you're doing is absolutely perfect. If you are not breathing well in your airstream quite effectively to begin with, then ultimately the not really going to. So I always like to just reinforce that it is the and the execution of the airstream, the consistency of the airstream that is paramount in having a good brass player sound good and play well. So I'm sure that there's been some background on breathing. I'm sure people do breathing very well, but just a few things to reinforce. Breathing should be a very natural process. When you encourage your young brass students to breathe, it should be something that they're doing in a very relaxed state. So breathing shouldn't be something that's really an effort or something that they calculate how to do. So I always just do like to reinforce that up front with an understanding that if the breathing and the airstream is not good to start with, none of the rest of it's probably going to really come together. Then the next thing is obviously going to the horn, and we were inviting a new young student to come to the horn. I think it's kind of important in certain steps. I think mistakes that frequently happens with young instrumentalists, maybe on any instrument, is they're kind of, they kind of hear, welcome to the band program, we're glad you're here, here's an instrument, take it home, learn how to play it. And that frequently can incorporate some, when students take an instrument and they kind of try to figure out, okay, what do I do with this instrument? How do I make a sound on it? And that can encourage them to start doing some things that are maybe not ultimately the best choices. So coming to the instrument in stages, I think, is important. And this is something that I do with any brass instrument, and in this case, the horn. So the first thing to engage is basically that breathing process. So you're just going to encourage students to breathe and get a lot of air in. Then the next thing is, how do we begin making a sound on the horn? So I would encourage you to introduce your students first to the mouthpiece and not necessarily the horn right to begin with, because as is the case with any brass instrument, the sound that they make on the mouthpiece is going to be directly tied to the sound they're going to make on the horn. So the first thing you want to do is get your young brass players breathing and buzzing. And so you want to get them to start to engage the concept of going and doing that. Now, that's not something that's going to be as easy for a young student as you might think. And for those who have tried it that are new to that process, getting your lips to vibrate right in the center is a little bit of a tricky issue. And so the things you're going to want to encourage with those younger students are getting some isometric flexing in the corners. Now, when I say isometric, of course, that's an exercise where you are flexing and tensing muscles without any movement. So I'm going to get in a little closer here. And when one forms the embouchure for the horn, you want to make sure that the corners are flexed and set, and to some degree, maybe coming down this way, like so. So when I've horn embouchure, you actually see what appears to be almost a set of parentheses that comes around the embouchure this way. The embouchure being the entire setup here, all of the muscles really from the corners, the nose, the chin, all of this business we would term as the embouchure. And now the really important part is what we call the aperture, which is the actual point or the space where the air is actually coming through. So in order to form that aperture and to get that to work, it's these muscles in the corners that really help set that and let that happen. This way. So you can see as those muscles flex and set, the firmness is really more out here in the corners, allowing relaxation in towards the center. The more the muscles get relaxed towards the center at the point of the aperture, that's what focuses the airflow through the aperture, creating that vibration. So that's very important for young brass players to really grasp that concept. And the things you want to watch for and avoid is any extra sense of tension in that embouchure, or particularly the aperture, such as this. Here are some negative examples you might want to make sure that you don't see. That kind of thing, which is obviously just too much tension right here in the center. The concept of, oh, if I bring a lot of tension to the point of vibration, that will help generate the vibration. Well, it in fact does generate a vibration, but not the one that you really want to get. So the concept to really teach and reinforce is working from this set of parentheses, tensing and setting the corners, and then letting the tension be here, relaxing towards the center, focusing the airstream this way. Some analogies you might encourage your students to understand, not things that you would want them to do in class, but if they had a mouthful of water and they were wanting to spray that water on one of their colleagues, how would they go about doing it? That's a concept, obviously not something physically that you would want to occur, certainly not in your classroom, but that concept of focusing something that they're wanting to send out of their mouth with a directional focus, that will kind of help bring that concept home. Now, the next thing, once that gets in place, and I've gone through that rather quickly just for time constraints, but that's something you would really want to spend some time with and work with to make sure that that's on track, because you know, some of the single greatest issues that brass players and particularly horn players will encounter that will bring negative results to their playing is having too much tension here in the embouchure, particularly in the aperture. So, you know, a little bit more research and study into this concept of getting that airstream really focused and getting that process going to begin with is very important as we establish good young horn players. Now, the next step would be once they kind of get that concept going, then to move to the mouthpiece. And when I'm working with young horn students and folks who are kind of teaching horn for the first time, there are a few easy things or a few easy processes that mouthpiece in the right place. Because placement on the embouchure can be very important to make sure that you're ultimately going to get the right sound down the road and to have the kind of flexibility that you want to have in your horn players. This will relate to range and other issues of technique. Getting the mouthpiece established in the right place is very important. The traditional French horn embouchure is usually described as 2/3 top lip and 1/3 bottom. Now, of course, students are going to have lips of very varying sizes. People's facial shapes are going to be different. Their jaw positions are going to be different. So you obviously are going to want to make allowances for that. And I do want to urge you up front to understand there is no such thing as the perfect French horn embouchure. If we were to get 100 professional horn players together and analyze embouchures and mouthpiece placements, you would see 100 variations on this exact conversation. So what I'm giving you here, generalities and general to-dos, and we'll talk about a few don'ts, but also an understanding that what works best for a single individual student may be different in every single case. But here are the basic generalities. When I'm encouraging people to learn how to put the mouthpiece on their face correctly to start with, step one, relax the face. Step two, take the mouthpiece and hold it perpendicular to the floor in this manner, and then take the side of the mouthpiece and place it against the lower lip, just inside where the red part, or what we would actually characterize as the lip, separates from the face. So what you would consider to be your face as opposed to your lip tissue, we're going to take the mouthpiece, hold it perpendicular to the floor, and place it just inside that point. And then with the lips completely relaxed, do this. So I'll do that once again from the side, so maybe it's a little clearer. Now, by doing that, that's going to get the mouthpiece in the right ballpark of essentially where it should go to then make the correct sound. So taking the students kind of through this process in the basics, step one, get a good breath. Step two, form that embouchure with the corners tensed and the relaxed, as we talked about. Then get the mouthpiece up there and pull. And then get that sound to kind of go through the center. So ultimately, the sound they're looking to achieve is something that could be identified as a pitch, something you might encourage your younger students to work with, or something you might even want to do in your band room to work with your young brass players, is even on the mouthpiece. A tuner should be able to identify a pitch and maybe even show the stability of that pitch. So if you've got things to work with in your band room, such as the app tonal energy, or just a regular standard tuner, as we do this, if that's going correctly, that sound coming through the mouthpiece should have a pitch and a center to it. Some things you would want to watch for are that kind of thing. That's going to be the sound you're going to hear if there's simply too much tension in and around that aperture point. So what we talked about a few minutes ago, if there's too much tension coming this way, right towards that aperture, airstream comes through, then you're going to hear the wavering kind of sound. On the other spectrum, if you encounter something like that, then that aperture is just simply too big. There's not enough space there for too much where the air is coming through to get the vibration to really set. So you would encourage the student at that point to go back to kind of working with that concept, which then becomes that. Now, a few basics I do want to show you about the brass mouthpiece and the embouchure that's important to remember in a young brass player, particularly a horn player, is that when I'm getting this sound on the mouthpiece, that is really not the same thing as this. Now I can buzz that same pitch, and the ability to play so the ability to control that aperture and that buzz is an important aspect conceptually. And it's something from a conceptual standpoint that as brass players advance, they should be able to do. So encourage over time as they get more comfortable with this process to be able to buzz parts of the scale, maybe a simple tune like that, that's important. But getting the aspect of focus here, the corners, and relaxation towards the center where the aperture is, Now, I'm going to put that up and make that same buzz, and then I'm going to quickly remove the mouthpiece and show you exactly what's happening here to get the right sound on the mouthpiece. You can actually see really the size of that aperture, which is rather large. Now, the reason that's occurring is because the mouthpiece itself, the actual physical placement, the mouthpiece pressure against the lips should be moderate, never too much, but also never too light. That mouthpiece pressure is really assisting in a foundational aspect of holding the lips and most particularly the aperture in place to assist with that buzz. Now, just a quick reinforcement you can offer your young students about this whole aspect of what's happening here with the aperture and the buzzing is to remind them of something they've probably all done many times before, and that's to blow up a balloon. If you blow up a balloon with air and then you take the end of the balloon and you pull it like this, we all know you can get the balloon to squeal and make a noise. And this is actually a good teaching aid you might consider using in your band room. Because if you blow up that balloon, hold the end of it and make it squeal, essentially what you're doing is creating exactly the same physical process of a brass embouchure. And to be able to show students that obviously the looser you hold that tension, the lower the sound that the balloon creates. The more you pull that tension, the higher the sound that the balloon creates with that squealing. But also, we all know if you take that and you pull it tight enough, then ultimately the sound stops altogether, because the amount of energy wanting to push the air out of the balloon, when that becomes less than the amount of force created at the point of vibration, then the vibration actually stops. So the optimum sound, if we're trying to get a nice tone out of the end of the balloon, it's a balance between the energy of the air coming out and the tension of the vibration being created. So for the student to kind of understand that's what they're doing, that's really important. So back to this issue of the mouthpiece. So at this point, we have got them breathing well, gotten the mouthpiece in the right place, gotten the mouthpiece up there and set, and then created a vibration, trying to get a good sound. I see we have a guest in the class. That's great.
Sorry, he was banging on the door. I figured it'd just be easier to let him in.
That's okay. We could get some guests from our house here in the class as well. But that's always good to see the folks that brighten our lives these days under these circumstances.
Yeah.
So we've got that vibration occurring. The next thing I would encourage you to, with young brass players in general, but particularly horn players, learning to play successfully on the mouthpiece to start with is going to save you and that student a lot of time down the road. Because I would encourage, and I realize that time is always a crunch for teachers in public school situations, but if you have maybe a week or even a few days working with those brass students in that first week or that early week, to have them play substantially or maybe even only on the mouthpiece for a few days, that's going to really help that development when they go to the instrument, which we'll do in just a minute. But some basic things like this. Getting them working with scales. Stuff like that. And some things that we call the siren. Brass players. The ability to go up and down an octave that way, much like a trombone player might do over there, moving their slide back and forth. But just getting that vibration, able to control that vibration from a lower pitch to a higher pitch, whether that be in the course of a scale, an arpeggio, or that siren exercise, are very good things to do with your young brass players, particularly horn players. Then get them playing some simple tunes. Maybe even take some songs they know, maybe play them over a sound system in your band room, get your brass players used to buzzing along with them and matching pitch using just the embouchure and the air. Because ultimately on a brass instrument, most particularly the horn, because of the range that we play in, truly controlling pitch in the embouchure and with the mouthpiece is where that success of accuracy and sound and tone and intonation and centeredness of pitch, all of those things that you're going to want to develop in your young horn players and brass players in general, that's where all of that is. Really, the instrument, in the case of a brass instrument, has very little to do with playing the right note or not. All of those aspects of accuracy and control come right here, these initial processes that we talked about. Now, the next step, and once again, we're moving very quickly here through this process, but obviously the next step, once you get your students comfortable with making a good sound and buzzing on the mouthpiece, is to take that to the instrument itself. So I'm going to slide over here and grab the horn. I'll be right back. Okay, so now the next step, we're obviously going to take the mouthpiece and put it into the horn. And it's very important that students remember that they not start to get their priorities out of order when they take the mouthpiece to the instrument, because that's why it is so important early on, right up front in those initial stages, to reinforce the breathing, reinforce the setup of the embouchure, reinforce the relaxation here at the aperture, reinforce correct mouthpiece placement, and make sure that those things then don't kind of begin to be forgotten when, oh, I'm now really excited. I've got this instrument in my hand. I'm ready to play it. And then they start doing different things when it's time to play the horn. So make sure those concepts stay reinforced. But very simply, when you go to the horn, one of the biggest things to encourage your students to remember is to stay as relaxed as possible when they go to the instrument. Now, of course, this obviously can be somewhat challenging for younger students, maybe middle school students, because as you well know, you're going to have a variety of physical sizes. Some of your students may already be 5 feet tall or more. Some of your students may still be very small. Some of them may have longer arms, some of them may have shorter arms. So one of the things I always encourage with even younger students is, as soon as your horn students are comfortable, I always encourage to teach your students actually to learn to play standing up. To what degree that's possible with, and this is really all your brass players with the exception of tuba, probably, but the default setting for playing an instrument relative to the breathing, body posture, and stance should always really be standing. And then when they sit, basically the thing that changes physically is they're going to obviously place themselves in a sitting position, but they're going to bend themselves at the waist. So the horn, in order to play the horn correctly, is basically getting yourself in the right position, the right posture for breathing, staying nice and relaxed in the shoulders. So there's no tension here, certainly no tension that's going to extend up here this way, or the breathing apparatus. And then bringing the horn, being careful to use the same mouthpiece placement that you've already studied and worked on with those students, so that they get used to bringing the instrument comfortably, reducing tension in the shoulders and the upper chest. They're simply going to raise the instrument to them and then place it in that mouthpiece position, breathing and doing all of those things we've already talked about that are so important. I keep using the word relaxed. The absolute enemy of good brass playing, particularly horn playing, is excess tension. So the thing you want to watch for is that you don't see students going this way, you're getting a lot of tension in the shoulders, or maybe a lot of tension here. You want to see that your students are not compressing themselves physically, or much more importantly, be careful you don't see this kind of thing, where maybe they're kind of going to the horn as opposed to bringing the horn to them. The thing you want to be conscious of is that breathing apparatus, the relaxation in the upper chest, neck. All of this, you want to stay right where you worked with step one, the breathing. Two, the relaxation set here. Three, the mouthpiece placement and the good movement of the airstream and vibration on the mouthpiece. So ultimately, your students should be remembering that they're not changing anything about that initial process we've worked on so far. They're just simply putting that mouthpiece into the horn, taking the horn, and comfortably bringing it to them in a very natural position and creating that sound. So now, as far as actually holding the instrument, the left hand, as you know, goes over here, little finger there, the valve fingers there, and assuming you're working with a double horn, the thumb valve there. You also want to encourage your students to keep this left hand as relaxed as possible. Now, one thing you can see from this angle, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this. I'm not gripping the horn here. The left hand wants to stay as relaxed as possible so that you've got a nice free movement of the fingers. So reducing tension is important here as well. Once again, this may be a bit for some younger students because you may find students with small hands and potentially they kind of barely hanging on here because they've got small hands. Now, one thing to be aware of is that horns, particularly those with string rotary valves, which you'll find on most instruments, can be adjusted for various hand sizes. So that's something you'd want to be aware of. I'm not going to get too far into that because that's almost a class in and of itself if we get into horn maintenance and adjustment. But that can be adjusted, and it's a fairly easy process. So if you have a student that's really struggling with the stretch of their hand, look into having that adjusted for them. It's not hard to do. But the important thing about the left hand is that it is stable and secure, but it remains as flexible and free as possible. Now, as I said earlier, an important concept to teach your students early on is to keep those fingers on the valves this way, so that when they're playing, you're not seeing what we refer to as the flying finger syndrome. Because obviously, if a student is playing quickly, it takes a lot longer for this motion to occur than for this motion to occur. So that's one thing to watch. Now, I will now give you a quick demonstration of how to put the right hand in the bell, which of course is mysteries of horn playing. Even other musicians who are not horn players frequently wonder, what's the whole right hand in the bell thing about? Well, of course, for a horn player, that's absolutely crucial because it does affect sound, it does affect tone, and it absolutely does affect intonation. Because horns are actually designed and built to play correctly in tune when the hand is in the right position in the bell. If it is not there, the horn will play sharp and you will have intonation issues. So training students to do that correctly up front is very important. And here are the simple steps that I teach students to go about to get their hand in basically the right place. This is like what we talked about with the mouthpiece placement. There is no exact same way that everyone does it, but what I'm going to teach you here are the basic fundamental parameters that will get each and every student in the right ballpark. So those steps are pretty simple. First thing, stick your hand out like this, nice and flat, fingers straight, as if you're going to shake hands with someone. Turn your palm upward, parallel with the ceiling. Fingers straight and the thumb in here. Notice there's no gaps or anything happening between the fingers. They're together. So I've got my palm like this. Now I'm going to cup my palm just enough as if an egg or a golf ball in the palm of my hand, it wouldn't roll out. So you can see there's a little bit of angle on my knuckle, a bit of angle in the fingers in the palm there, but still fingers together, thumb together, looking like this. So you could also maybe see this as potentially the Miss America wave position there. And now I'm going to take that and place it into the bell of the horn against, with the back of my fingers, against the bell of the horn. I'm going to slide it in that way to the point that it stops between my little finger and my thumb knuckle. There. Now you notice I still have been very careful to not create that gap there. My thumb is still against my hand. So fingers are still together, thumb is together, and I've placed that in against the bell to where it finds a nice place to secure itself, where it stops against that thumb knuckle there and the little finger here on this side. So now that affords for various bell throat sizes. You will find this part on the horn, this space in here, is different on different makes of horns. So with some horns it's larger, some horns it's smaller. And obviously your students are all going to have different sized hands. So it's important to get the right ratio or relative placement for hand size and bell throat size. So therefore this exercise, shake hands, fingers together, turn the palm up, cup it just enough that the egg won't roll out. It's like this. Take that without changing it into the bell. Let that move into the point that relative to their bell throat size and their hand size, it stops against that lower little finger and that upper thumb joint. That's going to get their hand in the right place. Now, then actually physically holding the instrument, I'm going to show you a technique that I don't encourage you to use with your younger students, but it's something to understand conceptually, and as they get more advanced, it might be something they would want to understand. But holding the instrument, as we talked about a minute ago, keeping that relaxation in the upper shoulders and arms. So basically the horn is nice and flexible here, and you can bring it comfortably to you to play that way. It basically is a balance between, as I put my hand in over here, that is not only helping to affect the sound, but it's also supporting the weight of this side of the instrument. Obviously, the rest of the weight is supported by the left hand on this side. And if I'm doing this correctly, basically I'm getting a balance between these two hands. So the horn is nice balance between the left and the right. Students, unless you've got a really good repair person that's great with dents on site, because you don't want your horns bouncing off the floor when they try this exercise and it doesn't go well the first time. But this is just to kind of show you that important sense of balance of the instrument and relaxation. So this is something you might show them, not ask them to do. But so the left hand supporting here, the right hand supporting here with that correct position. Very important things. Now, a couple of more words about the right hand. The things you want to watch for in the right hand are that once this position is secured, as a student starts to play, you want to make sure that you don't see this happening. Because obviously, as the hand comes this way, it's going to start to cover the sound. So if you find that your young players are creating a sound like that, where it's like, my goodness, it sounds like they have a pillow in their bell. Then the first thing you'd want to look for is that right hand closing too much. The other thing to watch for is younger students, unless they're really encouraged to understand how important this is, can get, you'll see a lot of things like this. Oh, it's a lot easier to hold the horn up if I do this. Well, That is going to make it easier to hold the horn possibly, but they're going to play very sharp and they're not going to create the right kind of sound. So it's very important to encourage them to realize that the correct position of this hand in creating the right tone and the right sound and the right pitch is just as important as what's going on with this hand, obviously with correct fingerings. So they obviously need to be pushing the correct valves to get the correct notes on this side, but this side is just as important. So that's left hand placement, right hand placement, holding the instrument, getting it to you, and then generating a sound with the mouthpiece placement, breathing, and so forth like that. So at this point, I realize I've been going quite a while with kind of some of these introductory basics on kind of how to approach the horn. Obviously, from this point, good things to do with your younger students are getting them to begin to match pitch with the instrument and then begin to work out from there with some simple different notes and parts of scales. And at this point, all of the things that you're going to find with some wonderful introductory methods that you might use relative to just some long tones, early parts of scales. That's where you're going to start to work into these things. But as a reinforcing comment, as all young students will want to do, as soon as they get to playing the instrument, inevitably the challenges of playing the instrument, the excitement of playing the instrument will potentially cause them to lose sight of some of these initial priorities we talked about. So just every day, reinforcing for your young students, breathe well. Make sure your embouchure is doing what it should. Make sure you're not getting too tight here in the center. Make sure that airstream is still there. Maybe every day for a while, maybe even a month. Start your sessions with, let's buzz a few notes before we go to the instrument, just as that consistent, constant reminder that what's happening here is going to make the foundation for everything else. Then what's happening there is going to generate how successful they are with that airstream. Then the ability to do that is going to be fundamental to what happens on the instrument. And reminding them that the sound they're making on the instrument itself is only a reinforcement or an amplification of what's actually happening here. So the ability to do it well on the mouthpiece is first and foremost. And if those concepts are reinforced, you're going to find yourself with much better and more successful and happier brass students after that first 6 months or after that first year than let's say with brass students that might be in a program that don't go through these basics to begin with. So at this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Russell if there's any particular questions that you'd like to put on the table at this point.
Sure. I have some of my own, and then I'll forward some from the kids. Can you talk a little bit about the F and the B flat horn? Like, what are the characteristics of each, and like if you were, obviously we want all of our kids to play on doubles, but then there's a big conversation about starting kids on single horns.
Right.
I think I already know what your answer is, but what would you prefer students start on, a single F horn or a single B flat horn? Sorry, that was like 3 questions, but go ahead.
Okay, I'll jump into that. Yes, in the case of the horn, most horn players, and I would say virtually all professional horn players, are going to play on instruments that are called double horns, and that's of course because we essentially have 2 instruments combined into one. And that relates to the harmonic series. Something that I'm sure you've studied with brass instruments is the harmonic series, and that is, of course, all of the pitches that can be gained on any single valve combination or slide position on the trombone. So any specific length of tubing has a harmonic series. In the case of the F horn, that harmonic series relates to the concert pitch of F, meaning that when a young horn student plays a C, they are playing a harmonic series based on what we as horn players think of the note as C, and all of the corresponding pitches that you'll find in the harmonic series. When we go from the F horn to the B flat horn by depressing this thumb key, it basically shortens the tubing by the interval of a fourth. So in other words, basically the harmonic series that we would play completely open with no valves at all, by depressing this thumb valve, it simply raises that harmonic series the interval of a fourth. So when I'm pushing, when I play this note, which I think of as middle C. That's my C, one ledger line below the treble clef staff. That is harmonic number 4 in the harmonic series on my F horn, which is the one that corresponds to that middle C. Now, when I play harmonic number 4, that middle C, if I push down my thumb valve, that is harmonic number 4 on my B flat series. So in other words, it's just the simple aspect of raising that entire harmonic series collectively by the interval of fourths. So that's what the F horn of the B flat horn does. The reason it's beneficial to horn players is because if you look at the harmonic series, once we get into the upper octaves of the horn, the harmonics get very close together. In much of what we consider to be the solo range of from the middle of the treble clef staff, actually the third line treble clef staff and above, every single note on the harmonic series is no wider than a whole step apart. And many of the intervals up in that range are a whole step, or in many cases, even a half step apart. So that's one reason that accuracy on the horn is challenging. And horn players are noted for the inevitable, what we refer to as the splee-off, or the cracked note. Horn players refer to those as approximaturas. It's a very important ornamentation that horn players do. But with that said, we try to avoid those as much as possible. And so when we go to the B flat horn, it actually, by the virtue of raising the harmonic series the interval of a fourth, it gives us a little more space and a little more distance between some of those harmonics in the higher range, and gives us a little bit more of a fighting chance of hitting those notes in the right center when we go to play them. So that's the F horn and the B flat horn. Now, one of the tonal characteristics of the two instruments, following up on Russell's question, is the F horn is obviously just a longer piece of tubing. So what we're dealing with any brass instrument, and the horn is no exception, is every time we touch a valve or depress a valve, we are lengthening the instrument by some bit of tubing. So in other words, for example, on the F horn, when I play that C, there, that's my harmonic number 4. That is harmonic number 4 simply because of the physical length of tubing I'm playing through. When I push down first valve, I'm extending the instrument by this much. So harmonic 4 goes to there. So when I push down first valve, it lowers harmonic number 4 by the interval of a whole step, then becoming B flat. So in the case of any brass instrument, horn's no exception, your open harmonic series, half step lower, whole step lower, step and a half lower, or step and a half lower. As the case with any brass instrument, 1 and 2 is the exact same length of tubing as 3, 2 full steps, and then on down like that. So you can work the harmonic series. So, but the F horn, by virtue of the fact that it's a longer piece of tubing, develops a slightly richer sound. There are more lower harmonics or more lower overtones sounding with the F horn simply because the tubing is longer. In the case of the B flat horn, when you shorten the instrument, it is a higher harmonic series, thereby meaning simply because it's a shorter tube, You're getting a little bit less of those lower overtones and harmonic sounding in your pitch that you play, and you're getting a little bit more of the top end sound. It's not drastic, but it's a little bit. And how well it will translate here, I'm not sure, but we'll give it a try. You may have heard a little bit of difference as I was going back and forth on the same note between the F horn and the B flat horn. I was simply moving this valve back and forth. So there is a little bit of a difference in shading and tone color between the two instruments. Is that something that a younger student should get really thinking about in a deep sort of way? No, probably not. So this is probably not information that's going to be pertinent to your middle school students. This is information that's probably only going to be realistic if you're working with really probably more of an advanced high school student. But with that said, when you start horn student, and this is something that I'm going to offer you an opinion here. This is certainly in the horn community, and I will tell you up front, there is no right answer to this question. I will simply offer you my opinion and take on the choice. If you have the opportunity to start your young horn students on double horns, absolutely take that choice, if at all possible. That is definitely the right way to go. But if you find yourself that you've inherited a collection of instruments, which is potentially they are single horns, or maybe you have an instrument that's donated to the program, or maybe you have a very limited budget and you simply have to make some budgetary choices which might be realistic. If you find yourself dealing with single horns and you have a choice, I do encourage starting young students on the single B flat horn. The reason for that is simply because of that accuracy issue, the ease of playing. It is a slightly shorter tube, and because of the fact that it raises that harmonic series a little bit, it's going to remove a little bit of that frustration that your young horn players will find with trying to hit the right note. So when they're sitting in that early band class with their colleagues who are playing euphonium or trumpet or saxophone or clarinet, and they're beginning to feel like, gosh, everybody else in here can hit the right note. Why is it still so challenging for me? If they were playing with a single B flat horn, it would ease that a little bit. And the aspect of, is that going to affect their concept of tone? No, not really. They can still play the instrument fundamentally correctly, and it's going to get their introduction into the process moving a little more quickly. And the reality is, among professional horn players, 80% of those players probably play 80 to 85% of the time on the B flat side of the instrument. So for me as a professional player, even with the double horn to go back and forth, I still create most of the pitches I play with the thumb down on the B flat side of the horn. So you will find traditional fingering charts in books about the horn, which are absolutely valuable and should be used. But there's an understanding as horn players get more advanced, and certainly if you're dealing with high school students who want to play the horn really well and are serious about developing their skills, helping them understand that there really are no right or wrong fingerings for any given note. There are the ones that work most effectively. I tell my advanced students at the collegiate level, the horn has 4 valves on it, 3 here and 1 here. And I encourage the use of those valves in any combination that's going to access the right harmonic series to create the correct pitch with the right intonation and the right sound. So as far as right and wrong fingerings to use, obviously there's some fingerings that don't work, and those are technically wrong. But with the sense of ones that can be used, I encourage your students, as they might have double horns, experiment with those and learn that you can do a lot of things on the F side of the horn. You can do a lot of things on the B side of the horn. and whichever ones work best for them, those are the right ones to use.
Um, can you talk a little bit about stopped horn technique with the right hand?
Yes. So going back to the right hand and that placement here, here, sliding it into the bell, getting it in the right place. So as I play a normal open note, and this is going to be, to make sure you can see it, I'm going to be a little bit strange in my position here, but so now if I were to go to stopped horn, I'm simply going to take my hand and fold it all the way over and try as much as possible to literally seal the opening. So what I'm trying to do is to create an airtight seal of that space. And that's what creates that nasal character in the sound that we think of as stopped horn. Now, the thing important to realize with stopped horn is that when I do stopped horn, that physically changes the pitch of the instrument. What it does to the instrument is it physically raises the harmonic series 1/2 step. To demonstrate that, there are harmonics 4, 5, and 6 on my open F horn series. If I go to the stopped horn, you can see it's taken that same harmonic series and it is raised 1/2 step. The reason is because the vibrating length of the tube when it's open is this long. When I close my hand off, it literally shortens the length of the instrument or the vibrating column to about here. And as we know, as that vibrating column gets shorter, the pitch goes up, as is the case with a string or anything that vibrates. So that's why the pitch changes. So in order to compensate for that, when your students play stopped horn, they are physically going to have to play a note, fingering. In other words, their execution of a note is going to have to be 1/2 step lower than what they actually see on the page. I'm going to get back to that in just a minute because that can be a little bit of a confusing conversation for middle schoolers, and I'll get. But the important is that they find the right hand position to create the best seal possible to play stopped horn. They want to get something that gets that nice tight buzz in the center of the sound. Now, I said a minute ago the interval of 1/2 step, particularly for younger students, and for that matter, even older advanced professionals. Because once again, the difference in the size of the horn here and the difference in the size of someone's hand. You may find, well, you will find that there's tremendous variation in where is the point that student can actually create that sound. So to get your students to play stopped horn well, first step, find that right place to get a good seal. So ask them first to work to make the right sound. So you want to work to get that sound concept correct. Then you might find that interval is highly variable. If they're playing with an instrument that's got a larger bell throat and they might have a particularly small hand, then that pitch is going to, maybe they're stopping the horn more about here than here, which means obviously the further they go this way, the more that pitch is going to go up. So they might actually have to think a whole step down what they're reading on the page. So once again, there are not going to be right and wrong fingerings or stopped notes. Simply stated, there's going to be what works. So even with my advanced college students, we frequently work through different stopped horn fingerings to find notes that will work and play in tune when they do the stopped horn. So step one, just to review, correct position, full seal as much as possible. Then listen to the sound and see if it's the right tone you want. Then at that point, it really is just to a large degree experimentation relative to that individual student, their physical size and the instrument they have, as to which fingerings are going to work correctly to get the right pitch they want. And, over time, they will just begin to kind of memorize those stop horn fingerings. That for me, when I see this note, I need to use this fingering to play that in tune.
And I just wanted to add on to that. There are stopped mutes, and generally we don't use those, at least for a majority of the range. But generally, like in the low part of the instrument, it's generally easier to use that stopped horn or that stopped mute. And if a
Yeah.
kid has too small of a hand, maybe. But then again, young kids, you're not really going to be running into stopped music a whole lot. But there are two different types of stop mutes: transposing and non-transposing. Um,
Right.
and so those transposing mutes do the transposition for you.
Right.
And that's key to note with your band director purchasing that equipment. Um, I guess one more question for me is, what are some things that commonly come to you when freshmen are coming into the university that you're typically having to fix, whether it's tension, which I think for me, I usually see tension. That's the thing I'm constantly fixing, or embouchure or whatever. What are the things that you commonly come across?
Generally, the biggest things that I work on when a student comes in, certainly the tension aspect is one, and tension as it relates to breathing. I mean, and this is something that's common in all brass players, and I think it's something that even all professional brass players think about on a daily basis, is making sure they're breathing well, making sure the airstream is coming from the right place. I mean, one thing we didn't even talk about was correct placement of the air, being very careful. The airstream being generated from very low down here, as opposed to what we call chest air. We all talk with chest air, but good brass playing air should be this air. It comes down from very low in the gut and gives you this very deep, fake operatic sort of voice when you use it. But that's one thing. I mean, that's very, very important to all brass students, and certainly very common where mistakes get made. Certainly, as Russell said, excess tension in the body, shoulders, neck, doing, strange things with the neck or this kind of thing. You certainly want to watch for that. And if you see any of those habits developing, try to move those out of the player as quickly as you can, because those will lead to increased bad habits down the road. If there are problems with sound, then you certainly want to look at what's happening in and with the embouchure or aperture. If there are problems with range, there may be issues with mouthpiece. And one thing I'll just mention at this point, I know it has been very popular for years to start horn players on trumpet. That's something that's been very common for decades, certainly throughout my lifetime. And it's something that I specifically recommend as not a good thing. The reason being that the correct mouthpiece placement and embouchure position for trumpet is almost exactly opposite of what it is for horn.
Right.
So it's fairly easy to identify students who might come to Honor Band Festival every year, or when I see high school students on a regular basis, those students that started on trumpet and were maybe even moderately successful on trumpet before switching to horn, when they come in trying to play the horn with a trumpet embouchure, they're going to have limited range. They're going to have issues in their playing. And most particularly, they have very little or no functional low range. And those are characteristics of getting that mouthpiece in the wrong position to begin with. So that's very important, something that you want to watch for. And so starting a young horn student on horn, I strongly recommend is the right way to go. This theory developed generations ago simply because the idea was that horn is very difficult. It's more difficult than other instruments. And so giving them the opportunity to start on trumpet and having a little bit quicker feel for success is the right way to go. But of course, the downside to that is they start on trumpet, they develop the feel for blowing a trumpet, they develop the mouthpiece and embouchure position for blowing a trumpet, and then they switch to the horn. And then the feeling is, oh my gosh, this is ridiculously difficult. This is so much harder than playing the trumpet. And the right way to do that is just take them to the horn to begin with.
Yeah.
As we've talked about this morning, get those basics in place to start with, get them beginning the right way, get them understanding. And on a psychological level, don't tell them up front that playing the horn is hard. Just show them how to do it, give them the basics, and let them think, oh, I should be doing the same thing all of my colleagues are. And they're ultimately that's going to give them better success right to begin with. So the things to watch for: tension, physical, neck, shoulders, what's going on in the embouchure here. And a little just a phrase that I like to give to music educators, and it's the same thing I give to horn students. When you're talking about sound or accuracy or pitch or anything that might be happening on the horn, this little sentence will help you diagnose both for you and for your students. If you'll simply remember this phrase: my sound is blank, therefore my aperture is blank. You can use the same term. So if you might say, oh, my sound is tight, therefore my aperture is tight. My sound is pinched, therefore my aperture is pinched. My sound is unfocused, therefore my aperture is unfocused. So you will find that the things that you will hourly with your ear identify in the sound, those are the same things that are going to lead you to what's happening right here at this point of sound generation. So if this is working well, what's coming out of the horn is also going to work well. If there's a problem with what's coming out of the horn, it's, as long as the instrument is in good physical condition, it's not the instrument. It's the source of the sound generation. So begin reverse engineering that sound. Take the mouthpiece out and make sure that's happening correctly. If there's something weird there, go back to the basics. If you find that, and going back to the most basics of basics, if you find that, gosh, the instrument's in good shape, their position looks good, they're not too tense, but I'm still hearing this, that's an airstream issue. That's really not the horn or the mouthpiece. That's just a breathe and blow issue. One of the greatest brass pedagogues of the 20th century was Arnold Jacobs, tuba player in the Chicago Symphony. And most of the world's great professionals found an opportunity at one time or another to go take a lesson with Arnold Jacobs. And Arnold Jacobs' teaching philosophy was pretty straightforward. The most common terms he used were breathe and blow. Breathe and blow. And when it comes right down to the basics of playing a brass instrument well, that's pretty much it.
Yeah. I so endorse everything that you just said, because especially when it comes to little kids, the teacher often is the one who defines like what is hard and what isn't. And a lot of the misconceptions that students have are because the teacher told them it was difficult. And I've walked in on teachers saying that this note's really high, so you've got to. Yeah. That's not the case. You know, the kid doesn't know any better. They know what you tell them, and yeah. And I just kind of want to reinforce a little bit about the just the tension in general. Gail Williams gave a really great session at Midwest this past year. She was part of a big Chicago group at Midwest, and she talked about breathing. And you know, she just said, "Raise your hand and relax." Like that's it. Like I think breathing sort of gets, especially with marching band, gets confused with this very strong arm activity that you have to force the air through the instrument and make it do what you want it to do. But that's not really how air works. It's this very natural, free-flowing thing. And my personal evolution on how to play the horn has changed within the past like 3 or 4 years or so, because I realized that, you know, if I just manipulate my tongue arch or if I manage my aperture better, then I don't really have to work as hard. Really, the less I have to work, the better I sound. Um,
Yep.
so just wanted to endorse everything that you just said. um, okay, I have one question from one of our students, and it seems like a simple question, but there's a lot to it. Why is it French? Why is it the French horn, and why do we now call it the horn?
That's actually a really great question because that was actually a mistake that was made historically quite a ways back. A little common joke is there's the French horn and there's the English horn. And the French horn is not French, nor is the English horn English. Those are both misnomers. Um, it is called the French horn because the history of the horn, the tradition of where it grew up, kind of comes from France. So, from a historical standpoint, the tradition of horn playing came out the whole aspect of the hunt and the hunting horn, which was very much kind of a French concept. And that goes way back into the 1600s, 1700s when horns began to develop as concert instruments. But the concept of the instrument as a concert instrument and most of the makers actually is far more German than it is French. And so in 1968, at the very first meeting of the International Horn Society, they passed an official declaration that the name of the instrument from that point forward would be horn. They officially dropped the French. So although we call it French horn for clarification, the actual name of the instrument is horn, because it's not French. And of course, the English horn comes from the term cor anglais, which is actually French, but that stands for angled horn, not English horn. The term cor anglais, which means horn with an angle, was anglicized to be confused as horn from England. So anyway, there's a quick answer to that question.
That's hilarious. Well, I think that's it. Skip, thank you so much for doing this. I know that we took up a chunk of your time, but so I want to thank you for offering your time. But I think that this is such a juicy hour of content that we've provided. So thank you.
Well, I'm happy to do it. And the last thing I always want to reinforce is when you get into working with your public school students, please never hesitate to reach out with questions to any qualified professional in your area. We have a lot of great people throughout the state of Alabama, teaching at various institutions, playing in symphony orchestras, and there are some wonderful resources in this state, all of whom would be happy to have you reach out to them with questions or to seek advice. So I recommend any of those people, but certainly those of you who might ever wish to reach out to me, my email address is easy to find on the School of Music website at the University of Alabama. And I am more than, actually, it's really gratifying. I appreciate it when I get emails from people around the state saying, hey, I've got an opportunity to buy some horns. What do you recommend? Or I need to get some mouthpieces for my beginning students. What do you recommend? Or even a question such as, I'm working with a beginning player and they're having trouble with this and this and this. What do you think might be going on? I'm always happy to offer advice. So as much as I hope you've gotten a lot out of this video, it's not important that you memorize every single detail, because at the point that you're actually physically at that point in your career working with those young students, never hesitate to reach out to me or any qualified professional for advice and help. They're always going to be more than happy to assist you in your process.
Awesome. Thank you again. Thank you.
Happy to do it.